Wish I'd done the smart thing, got some water with me. I got secret.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking out time out of your busy schedule to come for our flagship and the LGBT History Month event, Thinking Out Loud Together. It's LGBT History Month! My name is Dami Adesanya and I'm the Student President, Education and Welfare at RG Union, and Thinking Out Loud Together basically is an avenue for staff and students to speak together in a room to talk about real issues and, hoping that that conversation leads into something powerful in the future. And before I hand over to Greg, I just want to say a special thank you to all the students present here. Thank you so much for taking out time after lectures and being here for the event. I also want to say special thanks to our Director of Student Life, Principal Anthony Atsi. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Laura, who is the head of the Center for Collaborative Practice and Interprofessional Development, RGU. Thank you. And thank you also to Ross, who is Red Life Coordinator at RGU. And at this time, I will hand over to Greg, who will take us further in the event. Thank you.
Need to remember to use the mic. Hi everyone, welcome to our Thinking Out Loud event. Thinking Out Loud's just a forum where we can kind of discuss things openly, debate, and get a bit of a dialogue going. So the theme of today is blurring borders, and that's as part of LGBT plus History Month. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to our virtual audience for tuning in as well. So I suppose we'll get the ball rolling. I'd like to ask if each member of the panel would like to introduce themselves. We'll go from left to right. So just who you are, a wee bit about yourself, and your pronouns if you feel comfortable with them.
Great, yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Joe. I make artwork with Claudia. We graduated from the Contemporary Art Practice course at Grade School of Art last year, and now we're doing the Graduate in Residence program. Yeah, my pronouns are he and they, and yeah, I think that's everything. Is it? If I missed anything, I don't know.
No, yeah. Hi, I'm Claudia, and yeah, me and Joe graduated last year, and yeah, we're still making art, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Jem. I study forensic science in the third year, and I'm involved with the LGBTQ Student Network. So we host events that are open to everyone, but specifically a safe space for LGBTQ students, and my pronouns are she and they.
Hello, I'm Duncan Cohen. I'm the Vice Principal for Strategy and Planning at the University, but also the Equality Champion for Sexual Orientation for staff members. My pronouns are he, him, his.
All right, thank you, everyone. So now I've got your Wikipedia page here, Duncan. Only joking. But yeah, I'm just going to introduce our keynote speaker. It's top secret. I can't show you, I'm afraid. But I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. So this is our Vice Principal of Strategy and Planning. Duncan is a graduate of the University of Aberdeen, as RTU students, holding an MA Honours degree in History and a PhD on the subject of the development of Scottish medicine and science and the influence of Italy from 1495 to 1640. He's also a former president of the University of Aberdeen's Student Association, also again, as RGU students. Duncan took up this role in the higher education sector in 2004 as the head of SPARKS, Student Participation in the Quality Sector, before joining RGU in 2008 as the Principal's Policy Advisor. He was appointed as the Director of Planning and Policy at the University in 2013. In his current role, Duncan is also the executive lead for a number of departments, including communications, marketing, student recruitment and admissions, widening access, as well as strategy, planning and policy. Out with work, Duncan is active in the cultural sector. He was appointed to the board of Creative Scotland in 2019. At regional level, he is the chair of Culture Aberdeen, the city's cultural network responsible for the implementation and monitoring of the region's cultural strategy. He's also a board member of both Aberdeen Performing Arts and Sound, and was formerly chair of Look Again Visual Arts and Design Festival run across Aberdeen and led by the university. Duncan is a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. He's civilly partnered to Neil and they live together in Inverness with Flora, their dog. In his spare time, Duncan enjoys cooking, gardening and reading history books. So I'd like to introduce Duncan and his keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those words of introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this keynote speech. I'll put that in inverted commas because Firstly, you mentioned the fact that I have a history degree, and I'm going to mention the fact that I went to the University of Aberdeen, so you can move at that point if you like. As a historian, obviously my period of study is way past, in the distant past, back in the 16th, 17th century. So each month in February, each year in February, I always, I think, slightly regret the fact that actually LGBT History Month tends to focus actually on the history of the last 50 years, given that my period as a historian, well, I view this as politics, essentially, the last 50 years, not history. But the history of the last 50 years is actually incredibly important for the LGBT community. And part of that history is the importance of oral history. My own time period, the early modern period, actually, I'm a lazy historian. I quite like it because in the medieval period, there's too few documents, so you actually have hard work to find them. In the modern era, there's too much stuff to read, so it becomes too hard work. The early modern period's got the perfect amount of records and documents that it actually is much easier to comprehend. But what you miss in that period from the records is what people think, what they feel. The records are very good at telling people what people did. And this is where the importance of oral history and an oral history tradition comes into value. And actually what I'm going to talk about today is a small contribution to the oral history of the LGBT community over the last 50 years. And in that sense, I'm going to talk about what I thought throughout my life so far, what I felt at various points in my life, and how that corresponds to the transformation and the progress that has been made over my lifetime of nearly 50 years. I think what I would start by doing, actually, and I deliberately want to speak in terms of the personal, and I'll come back to why the personal is so important, and speaking about rights in the abstract is actually potentially highly dangerous. And I think we see in some of our discourse today, in today's society, why speaking in the abstract is potentially dangerous, and why speaking in the personal is so important to us all in the LGBT community. And what I want to talk about, and I first want to start by outing myself in some respects. Now, firstly, I think it's fairly clear that I'm an out gay man from the introduction. That introduction is what's on the university website, and I think it's highly important that I write that last sentence on the university website so people can know who I am and some of the values I bring to the workplace. But I also want to out myself as someone who is disabled, as a dyslexic, as someone who is a Catholic as well, someone who has faith. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to highlight that all of us have protected characteristics. Some of them are invisible. The fact I'm dyslexic, the fact I'm Catholic are not necessarily public property. They're hidden from view from most people. Others are distinctly public. They're visual in some sense. My sex is relatively visual. My ethnicity definitely is. And unfortunately, my age as a 45-year-old man is becoming more visible as I become grey and I lose my hair. Others are invisible, but critically are matters of the public record. And one of the points I want to make here is about sexual orientation. It's been suggested recently, actually, comparatively recently to me, that your sexual orientation is a private matter. Well, I think it can be a private matter, but for me, it is a matter of the public record. I am civilly partnered, and therefore it is very clear in the public registers that as I am civilly partnered to another man, I am a gay man. And I think we sometimes think that sexual orientation is this private matter and not a public matter. I wear a wedding ring, or civil partnership ring in my case, on my finger. I proclaim essentially the fact that I am a gay man. And as a result, there have been times when the suggestion has been, both in and out with work on occasions, that, and it's never this direct, it's always a little more oblique than this, that I am parading my sexuality. But I wanted to start off by highlighting that I keep some of my protected characteristics hidden from view, because, and some of them not, because 25 years ago, I'm not sure I would have hid the same things that I hide in today's society. And one of the aspects that I'm very open about in terms of my protected characteristics, I definitely hid from people, including those very close to me as family members. The theme of this year's History Month is about blurred boundaries. And I think there's an invitation to recognise within that blurred boundaries the fact that actually the journeys that different countries are on are at different stages in their story around recognising LGBT rights. But there's also a particular line in the narrative that comes out from LGBT Scotland about this year's History Month. And that's this statement: the direction of travel has not always been linear. The waves of progress have ebbed and flowed. And this is a point I want to come back to, because I want to actually speak about essentially rights here. And I will ask for a bit of audience participation later, just to warn you. I was born in 1976. At that time, it's important to bear in mind, homosexuality was still criminalised in Scotland. I didn't grow up in Scotland, I grew up in London, but it's often believed that actually homosexuality in the UK was decriminalised in 1967. Wrong. That's the case for England and Wales. And it's not until 1981 that the same decriminalisation takes place in Scotland. So for the first 5 years of my life, albeit not one that I was living in Scotland, being a homosexual, or certainly engaging in homosexual acts, was criminalised and illegal. I went to primary school in the early 80s. I went to a Catholic primary school, as I think I probably can deduce by one of my outings earlier. And it was a Catholic school, which unsurprisingly didn't discuss sex education at all, not even the heterosexual version of sex. But it was a Catholic school where pop music like Boy George and Come a Chameleon was considered appropriate enough to put on a stage of a primary school, which demonstrates actually in some respects some of the naivety, maybe some of the innocence that existed in the 1980s, but also actually how much LGBT people were in the public view. Boy George was very prominent at the time, and actually we often forget that the 1980s had, if you like, a distinct subculture that celebrated LGBT rights. As a child, all of that was relatively invisible to me. What was highly visible to me as a child were all of the AIDS adverts. Now, I don't know whether anyone has seen them, but basically imagine a massive black tombstone with the words AIDS written in them, falling over and cracking itself and extolling the virtues essentially of a celibate homosexual life. And it wasn't particularly hidden from view for a primary school child. So my growing up, my early understanding of what a gay man was essentially someone with a limited life expectancy. And that was about it. Now, sex education, I think in a Catholic school, as I've highlighted, was non-existent. Interestingly, I learnt my sex education on a football pitch at said primary school by the son of a very enlightened German Catholic couple who had explained the act of human reproduction in what can only be described as very detailed technical manual, if you like. But it was an entirely heteronormative account of sex, and that heteronormative account of sex continued throughout my secondary school. No mention whatsoever of homosexuality in the curriculum in sex education. And actually, as a first year, and there's something particularly strange about groups of school children when they mass together. I think it brings out their feral instincts as wild animals or something like that. For whatever reason, correctly, as it turns out, I was labelled as a homosexual, as a gay, long before even I articulated it myself. So I grew up in a secondary school feeling deeply isolated by an identity that was thrust on me, I suppose, by other school children, coming to terms with the fact that actually I was gay. And it's probably because at some moment I hesitated, some inward doubt allowed people the joy of realizing that they got hold of something on me. Now, of course, the school was aware that I was being bullied, but they were probably undoubtedly aware on the terms of which I was being bullied. But of course, neither I nor the school acknowledged its homophobic nature. Unquestionably, that led to a much greater struggle for me in terms of coming out. And of course, all the while, we are still living in a world in the 1980s where sex education is predominantly heteronormative. It isn't possible to have a civil partnership. It isn't possible to marry. It is possible to be sacked from the workplace. The public discourse around LGBT individuals is frankly highly marginalizing, to say the least. And in 1998, the year after I started secondary school, a law is passed which quite clearly states a local authority shall not, A, intentionally promote homosexuality or publish material with the intention of promoting homosexuality, or B, promoting the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. Now that has the effect of meaning that actually not only do schools shy away from talking about potential family relationships that have two men or two women in them, which there were in my school, and they were just airbrushed completely, but it also has the effect of meaning that teachers are completely scared off confronting any form of homophobic abuse in schools, whether I'm a victim of it or whether other individuals are a victim of it. So the intention was to restrict sex education. The effect was to essentially airbrush out the identities of many individuals that attended school. And I'm very grateful for the fact that actually now the average age of coming out in Scotland is 15. But if you grew up in a secondary school environment where there was no mention of LGBT people, then it was very difficult to acknowledge that in any meaningful way, even though you were aware that you were probably not the only individual in that school who was. I came to university, well, before I came to university, I remember travelling back from the centre of London in 1994. I looked across the River Thames from Victoria Station. I looked across the river, and it was 10 o'clock, and I was aware that night there was a vote in Parliament that would have allowed me to have sex at the age of 18, which I was about to turn in a couple of months' time. Now, of course, you need to bear in mind that any notion of the fact that I might have a meaningful relationship in my life at the age of 18 or 17 was completely put to one side. One realised that if one needed a career, then one was going to have a relationship, certainly not a homosexual one, because obviously that would put you at great risk in terms of your career and your ability to lead a meaningful life. It certainly wasn't possible to get a mortgage or set up a house with anyone at this time. So the notion of having a relationship, let alone sex, was quite far from my mind. And this is growing up in London, a comparatively liberal city at the time. And I looked across and I realised that actually at that point in Parliament, they were taking a vote on whether or not the age of consent should be reduced from 21 to 18 for men. Now, I just want to pause and talk about actually how we talk about the age of consent in this country. We don't actually, in legislation, talk about the age of consent. We don't talk about equalisation of age of consent in statutory laws. I happened to chance myself just before Christmas looking at the legislation that equalises the age of consent at 16, which was in 2000. And it's called the Sexual Offences Amendment Act. Its only purpose is to equalise the age of consent across heterosexual and homosexual individuals. And yet actually, It's called the Sexual Offences Amendment Act. If you read the legislation, you would actually, I was quite shocked by this apparent liberalising legislation, that actually the entire tone of this legislation from only 22 years ago is essentially one of stigma and one of saying what is wrong, and yes, this bit here might now be right. So even our discourse when it comes to equality in this country is one of a glass half empty. It's about talking about the negatives rather than the positives. So I come to university as a 19-year-old man, able, I suppose, legally to have sex with another man. And that's the point at which I confront, and I think most people of my generation did confront, the possibility of coming out. You're away from your family for the first time. And I remember I had a very difficult first year, actually, because I increasingly was aware that I was a gay man. I realized I had this opportunity to live my life as a gay man away from my family, and eventually came out to a very close selection of friends, and increasingly became more and more comfortable with that. But you must remember that at this point in time, only 11% of people believe that a gay relationship is never wrong. Now, so the vast majority of society around me at this time actually believed that a homosexual relationship was sometimes always wrong, sometimes wrong, but only 11% believed it was never wrong to have a homosexual relationship. And of course, that mediates your coming out, that mediates your who you trust about that information, who you decide to share with that information with. When I stood as a sabbatical officer, just in about 2001, I think it was, I was very out by that point. But I suppose my campaign team were very aware of the fact that I would have been the first openly out president of the Student Association. And they were all like, ooh, I'm not sure that you can necessarily assume that people are going to vote for a gay man to be president of the Student Association. So we actually hid, I won't tell you here how we hid my sexuality or disguised my sexuality, probably more to the point. I won't say that on camera, I'll tell people afterwards if you want. But I suppose it talks about the fear at the time, even from a liberalised student body, about actually what being an out gay man was and whether or not the student body at a university of all places was willing to have a gay man as its president. We did this annual ball, and at one of the speeches, I don't think I hid the fact I was a gay man during my presidency, not even with the university management. But at the end of my 2 years of being president, we had, as we did, usually an annual dinner. We did various speeches. I did a speech, and I openly acknowledged the support of my then partner. Next Monday's university senior management group at the University of Aberdeen, this was discussed. Did you know that he was gay? And they were completely surprised. And actually, on one level, it speaks about how much of a talking point someone's sexuality could be, even 20 years ago, for individuals. I said it without thinking about it, and yet actually, for the university senior management group, it was considered some great coming out speech and worthy of commentary. I was lucky when I started work in 2004. By that stage, it wasn't illegal to sack as a gay man. That was just happened the previous year, thankfully, 2003. And I started work in NUS Scotland, working for Sparks. I was very lucky there. I didn't really need to think about coming out, actually, and all the difficulties that you might experience as an employee in terms of coming out when you trust your work colleagues about your private life, i.e. who you happen to maybe live with, and what you might do on the weekends, in the evening with them. Because actually, everyone was either a woman or a gay man, essentially working for NUS. I think a tradition that continues even to this day. And so the first time I had to really consider actually coming out in the workplace was when I started working for Royal University in 2008. And I suppose that was when I first confronted the fact that actually we do need to be very careful sometimes about who you tell. You are never quite certain about what reaction you're going to have from people. I'm glad to say that actually the reaction has been altogether very positive. It's been, no one's blinked an eyelid, as they shouldn't. But I suppose that decision is one that lives with you. You don't come out once. You come out on a continual basis at every point. You are making decisions about when it is you tell people. Now, that gives you a story of my life, and I suppose in part tells you how a discriminatory framework has affected my life, my upbringing, and partly explains why people say, well, LGBT people have these rights. What are you moaning about now? It does slightly bar me, because you think, well, hang on a moment. Those life experiences that I've had, let alone anyone who might be 10, 20, 30 years older than me, have shaped the way in which I form relationships, that shape the way in which I identify, shape the way in which I carry out certain aspects of my life. There is absolutely no chance that I will ever hold hands with my partner in public. It's just something I'm conditioned, as is he, not to do. Now, I'm sure I would be relatively safe in doing so, but actually that baggage of the last 40, 45 years that I carry with me shapes some of my behaviours even now, and restrains some of what might actually be considered quite normal behaviour in a relationship of however many years. I think it must be 14, 15 years, something like that. It's terrible when you forget that type of thing, and I'll get told off for that later. And I suppose it's those elements that shape something else in society today, which is actually we have legislative equality, and I'll come back to the dangers and the fragility of that in a moment. But we also have a series of circumstances which, as a result of that discrimination that is inherent within our country, have resulted in inequalities in today. And this is where I'm going to ask for some audience participation. So, who wants to guess the percentage of LGBT young people who rate their experience as bad? So my experience, pretty bad actually, I have to say, as a young gay man of about 20, 25 years ago. But how many people would you say LGBT people in Scotland? Anyone want to guess?
98.
I think it's bad. Fortunately, it's lower than that. It's just under half, 46% of LGBT young people rate their school experience as bad, against non-LGBT rate at about 10%. So it's quite a significant difference. How many LGBT people leave education? This could be secondary or further or higher education as a result of homophobia, biphobia or transphobia in their learning environment.
30%? 30%?
30%, again, not as depressing as that. It's only 9%. But that's 1 in 10 individuals leave education as a result of bullying in their learning environment. How many young people are bullied at school? LGBT young people, that is.
60%.
Close. See, it's worse than that. It's 71% in Scotland today. 25% in college, 14% at university. How many LGBT young people have experienced suicidal thoughts?
80%.
80%. Slightly better than that, 50%. But it's still half of LGBT young people. How many, and this isn't just young people, this is LGBT people generally, how many LGBT people living with family members are not open about being LGBT?
50%? 50?
Half of that, 25%. So a quarter of people, and that's all people of all ages. I mentioned the fact that I won't hold hands with my partner earlier. How many LGBT people won't hold hands in public? Close, 68%. So the vast majority of LGBT people won't do something as normal and natural as holding hands with their partner. How many individuals, LGBT individuals, have experienced their outing without their permission in the workplace?
60%.
60, no, it's only 11%. That again, 1 in 10 people don't give their permission to such activity. How many LGBT people have been offered conversion therapy?
1%.
7%. So 5% have been offered it and didn't take it. 2% have then undergone it. In rural areas, how many people, and this is in Scottish rural areas, how many people have personally experienced prejudice or discrimination? 50%. And that compares with 23% in urban areas. There's a big difference in experience. And if you look underneath those figures, that includes 15% of people who have had an attack on their property as a result of being LGBT. How many people in rural areas in Scotland would not be out to their neighbours? Close, 31%. Now, thank you for your audience participation. I suppose what I'm pointing out there is that that essentially legislative framework of discrimination that has been slowly dismantled during my lifetime leaves with it scars in today's society, and quite significant scars as a result. And actually, those are the problems that now we need to tackle as a society. But I said I wanted to say something about why saying something personal and not abstract was important. We like to think that we live in a tolerant society in the UK. But we often forget the fact that tolerance as a word doesn't mean inclusivity. It doesn't mean recognizing diversity. Actually, it means putting up with. In other words, tolerance is about saying, yeah, I can see you're different, and I'm going to put up with that difference. The first community groups to experience tolerance were the Jews. And the way in which Western society dealt with tolerating Jewish communities was to create ghettos. And yet now, we talk about tolerance as if it is an important and central value. We forget the fact that tolerance merely means I'm going to put up with you. I mentioned earlier about the way in which, in a society which wants to equalize rights, we actually talk about the wrong. So an age of consent equalization is expressed in terms of a sexual offense. And the Equality Act does something quite similar. It makes 3 duties that it puts on public authorities. The first is to eliminate discrimination. I think the figures that I've just highlighted illustrate how clearly that discrimination continues in today's society, even in a tolerant nation. The second is to promote equality. Well, there's a long way to go on that. The third is to promote good relations, as if the starting point needs to be that there be bad relations between people of different characteristics. Nowhere in that legislative framework does it talk about celebrating diversity, creating an inclusive society. And I think we see that reflected in some of the debates that we've had in recent years around some LGBT rights. Back in the 1970s, And this is a story that a friend told me when about 20 years ago, he was reflecting on the rights that LGBT people were now beginning to have at the turn of this millennium. He'd gone to university roughly 20 years before me, mid-70s, and he talked about a period in time when actually in the 1970s in the UK, effectively, LGBT people had an awful lot of acceptance within society in their periods. You know, you had to make certain compromises, but actually it was probably a more free, probably a more liberal era than I experienced going to university in the 90s. We must never take for granted that actually the rights that we've accorded people today are here forever. The environment of the 1970s changed at a stroke with AIDS and the AIDS panic, Section 2A, and the stopping of discussing homosexuality within schools. That advert, which I referred to earlier, sums up some of those attitudes and why society shifted its influences. Never forget, the first country in the world to decriminalize homosexuality was the French Revolutionary Republic under Napoleon. It did so in 1798. Never forget also that it then decided to change those rules, those laws, that legislation. Equally well, remember how tolerant the Berlin of the 1920s was in terms of LGBT rights and acceptance. Never forget that just 10 years later, the leadership was sending LGBT people to the gas chambers. Now, I don't think anything as dramatic is going to happen in this country. But when we concentrate on the abstract, when we concentrate on theoretical debates, and we forget that actually there are people and there are people's lives, we take the humanity out of equality and diversity, and we replace it with something quite different, where we end up not actually celebrating difference, celebrating diversity, but at best tolerating difference. And that's what I see in today's debates about LGBT rights. I see people who have removed the human beings from the equation. And I think if I have any message for you today, it's remember that humans have different stories. And that actually, when we listen to those stories, when we take time to reflect upon those individuals, the likelihood is that we will be far more understanding and accommodating in the rights that we recognize that those individuals have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for that really personal account of history. I think it was really, really touching, actually. So we're going to move on to our next section, which is the panel members' discussion. I've got a list of about 6 questions here, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I suppose we'll go right to left, maybe switch it up with each question. And the first question we have is, what is LGBT history and why does it matter to us? And I'll start with Duncan then, take us down.
Well, so I suppose I'll be very quick and just simply say, for me, LGBT history actually is the collection of individual experiences. I hope that what I've shared and what other people will share adds to that sense of history.
Absolutely, I agree that everything we just heard Duncan share is very much why we celebrate LGBT history. It's through knowing what happened in the past, we understand the experiences people are still living through and how we can improve on those experiences.
Yeah, I feel like I agree. I think it's just like important to listen and like hear from what people have been through to like, I don't know, learn and know from.
Yeah, I suppose it's that thing about making sure we're aware of like mistakes that we've already made so that we don't make them again. Yeah, and just, I don't know, it's so interesting to hear about the way that the pendulum swings as well, so that we can be aware of how to deal with it should that swing back again, you know?
I think those are all really good points. I think we probably quite often have quite a hard time looking back on our history and maybe judging it. So I think that's all really interesting. And the next question, which kind of leads on from that, is what is our commitment to LGBT-related issues, and how do we ensure that this commitment is translated into real action and demonstrable change, especially for young members of the LGBT community who we've obviously just heard go through a really rough and traumatic experience in school, which is quite different to straight or heterosexual students. I'll start from the left, then go to the right this time.
Yeah, I think personally, like the work that me and Claudia make together is definitely a celebration of like queer aesthetics and trying to make space to reclaim queer enjoyment and like give it a kind of really positive narrative after having, for myself anyway, also a very negative experience like throughout school and feeling kind of like really sick of being made to feel that way and still kind of like reconciling with that as an adult and trying to kind of like flip that and kind of like start with myself to then be able to hopefully kind of like pass that on to other people as well. So I feel like that's my personal commitment to it at the moment, is like through making art. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I feel the same. I think it's like, especially because it can feel like very like heavy and like, oh no, this is all terrible, and like you hear these kind of statistics and stuff. And then I feel like how Joe was saying, it's like the stuff that we're doing is like wanting to like embrace it and celebrate it and then like enjoy it and then have other people see it and then hopefully enjoy it as well. So yeah.
Absolutely. All that you said sounds very good, and coming from joy as well is very important. What I think every individual could commit to is to be open and be willing to learn about things that they might not know about, because it can be very exhausting as an LGBTQ person to feel like you have to advocate for yourself and educate others all the time. So if we could just create this environment where everyone is willing to learn and open to learn from each other, that would improve things greatly, I think.
I think for me, I suppose I'm guilty actually of giving a kind of half glass empty story of my life, and that isn't, of course, the full story of my life. There is much joy and much happiness. I think the point I was making around celebrating diversity is actually that I think if we're not careful, we run the risk of airbrushing out the bad bits, but equally well, actually, in our quest for equality, becoming the same. And I think that's that I'm not happy with, actually. Personally, I think that we missed as a community an opportunity when it came to gay marriage to celebrate something unique about gay relationships, and actually our form of words just follows the heterosexual form. In other words, we have heteronormized ourselves, and I think that's a great shame. And actually, that sense of community and the differences that it has. Long gone are the days of the hanky-cone and polarity, if you see what I mean, as things. But some of those words still exist in the way in which LGBT people speak to one another. And I think they're to be celebrated, actually, and joy taken from them. In that regard, I think we maybe need to be careful that we don't lose that sense of what makes us sometimes special as human beings. I talked about the fact that I was dyslexic earlier. There's a great book written which explains all the benefits that come from having dyslexia, called The Gift of Dyslexia. And it's a disability, but it also gives you many benefits. And actually all those figures that I reeled off explain all the downsides of actually being LGBT. Try finding any research on what the upsides of being LGBT are. And you are struggling, but I'm convinced that they must be there. And I think I look forward to a day where we can articulate that more proudly. So I think my advice to people coming to university is to be proud of who you are, to recognize that actually being an LGBT individual will give you different insights and will enable you to see the world in a different way. And I think in terms of providing support for the university, it's why events such as these are so important. It's why actually so many staff wear the rainbow lanyard to signify that actually this is meant to be, although it will sometimes fail to be, it is meant to be a safe and inclusive environment for all, including the LGBT community.
My next question is, I suppose, something from the perspective of those who want to be allies to the community in the best way possible. What sensitivities do we need to kind of educate ourselves on when we're trying to advance the cause of LGBT plus rights and advance the cause of equality? And this one I'll go from right to left.
I'm still processing the question. I'll pass it on.
I think there's a lot of talk about normalizing using pronouns for people, and I think that's coming from a very good place. But it's also being very sensitive and aware that sometimes people are in situations where they can't use the pronouns that they would want to if they don't feel safe. So to pose it as an option, to make sure that people feel comfortable if possible, and yeah, genuinely just trying to create spaces that allow people to be authentically themselves, which isn't always as simple, and possibly being understanding that things can fluctuate and there can be changes to help people identify in which spaces they are also feel comfortable being themselves.
I feel like maybe just for non-LGBT people, just like come in with openness. Like nobody's trying to do anything crazy. Like it's just everyone just wants to get on with their day. And I feel like if you just come at it with openness, like I don't know, that's a good way to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really agree with what you're saying about like that fluctuation, because like it can feel sometimes like, because it is such like a big thing sometimes to kind of like, you know, come out with your real or authentic identity to the world or to your family, whoever, that it feels like that becomes like this new kind of framework that people understand you through. But it is so fluid for so many people, and maybe more than a lot of people even realize about themselves, I think. So yeah, being able to give yourself as LGBT people like that openness to be sure of that in your identity, but also know that like it can change and that's fine. And for the people around them as well to like hopefully be able to deal with that in a positive way. Yeah.
I'll return to you, Duncan.
Yeah, I think I'd like to sort of echo a lot of that. It's about, for me, it's about treating people as individuals, not pigeonhole them actually. And a word that was used earlier was about openness. And that doesn't actually mean to tolerate. That means to accept, to recognize, to include, to actually embrace.
Okay, thank you everyone for that. Now we're on to question 4. So what lessons from recent, and this fits in quite well with the speech you gave earlier, what lessons from recent LGBT history can help us achieve progress in the big debates facing this country today? I'll go from left to right this time.
I don't know, I need some time to think.
I'll go from right to left this time, if that's okay.
I suppose I'll just repeat my central plea, which is we must not assume that the rights that are given in law can't be taken away. And actually, the more, in some respects, the same everyone is treated, the easier it is to other people, actually, in some respects. That's how it happens in history. And I think we are seeing that, some of the debates around the trans community at the moment, where effectively people who have had rights in law that existed for decades in some instances, been systematically targeted. And I think that's the thin edge of the wedge. And we need to be very, very careful about that, actually, as a society. I'm sure that You know, in some respects, we think that will never happen to us. I don't think the Western world has yet comprehended what took place last January in America, where we saw essentially an armed insurrection. And that's what the FBI has called it, and it's charged various individuals. So one less than treason, if you like, an armed insurrection by a group of people who we also know want to trample on many of the rights that have been given to people under legislation such as the Equalities Act. So to think that that might never happen and can't happen in society, I think is a very dangerous position. We actually see that in the LGBT community today.
Absolutely. I feel like there's been very scary trends happening all over Europe with conversations of banning LGBTQ teaching, banning LGBTQ rights, and just to be aware that what Duncan said, that it is scary because all the legislation is quite new. So it's to be aware that that hasn't always been the case, and understanding how politics basically works, even though it's very sad thing that we debate human rights, that is what's going on. And being aware that just because you live in a place that you feel is safe, not everyone gets to experience that, sadly. Yeah.
I think that's why like these types of conversations are so good, because it's like, so because where you live, okay, it's not as bad, being able to be like, oh no, but then, and like even within Duncan's story, like history, and like being able to see like this is where they've come so that I can be here, and like realize that it's like this is because of people before me.
I think as well, yeah, like seeing the way that trans people are now being treated in such a similar fashion to the way that a lot of the rest of the community is being treated leading up to that, and the way that it does just look like repetition. Like, yeah, it's scary.
Okay, my next question is, how can we harness the power of, and this is something else that we touched on in this conversation, how can we harness the power of conversations like this to increase equality and visibility for trans people on campus? I'll go left to right this time, if that's okay.
I feel like maybe actually like having conversations with trans people, you know, like I don't identify as trans, and I feel like it's hard for me to say, you know, it's about listening to those people. So I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I can interject with a follow-up,
Yeah.
which isn't on the paper, how do we encourage, or how can we work to encourage trans people to engage with the union and engage with us on an institutional level? Because I do agree in the sense of I'm up on the board there, unfortunately, for some, but I'm not part of the community. So how do we start to engage trans and LGBT people with conversations like these?
I think maybe like I said, events and similar events to this, where it is maybe like more casual, more kind of like centered around listening to other people on a kind of like candid basis. And like, I mean, even things like the lanyards and like having very visual based things around the uni, like it is a signifier that like this is at least a space that is attempting to be inclusive and safe for you. And so yeah, I don't know, it's like actually calling out to people, I think, is what needs to happen, rather than like waiting to hear from these people about what they need. And like we were talking earlier about like the changing of bathrooms like in the library from having like male and female on alternating floors, which just seems like, you know, it's kind of like confusing or just not very accessible for people. And having gender neutral bathrooms, and like, okay, what's the next step then? You know, it's not all just about like going to the toilet, you know, like there's so much more to it than that. Just finding out like, what are those things? What else can we do for you?
Okay, and I'll repeat the question, sorry, because I know we went off there. But I think it's an important conversation to have, because I do feel that we need to make a conscious effort to reach out. And so I'll repeat the question, we'll go from the right. How can we harness the power of conversations like this to increase equality and visibility for trans people on campus?
So definitely what we were talking about is having trans people at the center of the conversation. I think very clear things that university can do to make trans people feel welcome and safe is having a good system of how you get your name on your student card, to make trans students comfortable to come out at university, to make it easy for you to change your student card and change your name on your student card in case that's something you feel will help you, if that's something you realize about yourself while you're at university. And we've also put forward a motion for the annual general meeting to establish gender-neutral bathrooms across campus. And that is a conversation that I have not been a part of because I haven't been as involved previously, but I know that has been ongoing for the past 4 years. So I'm not fully aware what the struggles have been during those times. I just know that, as was mentioned, the library bathrooms were the only ones that were changed to gender neutral, even though there was a request for more of it. And I think it seems quite silly to some people for gender neutral bathrooms. It's such a cliche topic when we talk about LGBT topics, but it is very important because we do have non-binary students on campus, and it's such a small thing that really just shows that they have a place to belong, and that this is not a space where they need to overthink it and worry about it, because all of this worry just causes anxiety in the students and in just everyone who moves around this space, which distracts from why they're here, which is to learn and to grow. So making it just easier for everyone to exist in this space really goes a long way.
Gender neutral bathrooms. I'm afraid it's been more than 4 years since the university has been having that discussion. And as someone who has been involved in many years of discussion around gender neutral bathrooms, I think this is a very neat illustration of what I was saying about the dealing of issues in the abstract versus the dealing of issues in the personal. And I think actually it's very easy for an institution to fall into abstract thought around topics like gender neutral toilets and not actually see the human dimension, the human difficulties, the human suffering on occasion that causes. And I think that one of the things that has always perplexed me about the gender neutral bathroom issue is that actually all of us live in an environment that has a gender neutral bathroom. It's usually called our home. And actually, in a public space, we then add in a problem to that. And actually, the reason we add in a problem to that is because we don't actually hear the stories of lived experience. We don't hear those personal experiences. Part of your question, Greg, was actually how do we get hold of things? And I think they're important because actually, if you look at the university's statistics, there's still just over 5% of students who are uncomfortable providing any information about their sexual orientation. That's the highest proportion for all the equality characteristics. People are more accepting even to tell you what faith they are. But 5.6% of our students don't want to tell us what sexual orientation are. And as a consequence of that, it makes what I'm about to say, it gives it a slight question mark. This highlights the importance of declaring anonymously that information. So what we do know from students who have declared their sexual orientation is that they are more likely at this university, as they are in other universities, at withdrawing early from their study. They are less likely to be satisfied as they are at other universities. They are fortunately just as likely to get good degrees, slightly less likely to get professional employment, and distinctly more likely to seek that professional employment outside of Aberdeen City and Shire, which is compared with heterosexuals. Now that may say something about the region. And of course, behind that, there is the story of why that is the case. And the numbers alone can't provide the answer, but they do identify a difference of experience and a lack of equality. One of the reports that I quoted the figures from earlier was a report published by the LGBT the Equality Network in Scotland around the rural experience. And one of the authors, Scott Cuthbertson, has done a huge amount of work in going around rural areas in Scotland over the course of the last 2 years, setting up stalls, having community-based events. And actually, I think there is an opportunity for us to replicate some of that work within our own community, to discover some of the reasons that lie behind that difference of experience among the student body, but also to bring to life some of the personal stories around issues such as gender-neutral bathrooms.
If anyone wants to add anything at the end of that, by the way, please feel free. I know we always say it's we want a discussion. I know sometimes it can be quite formal, but please just feel free to shout if you've got any, differing opinions or anything like that. But I'll move on, unless anyone has any, I'll move on to our last question. How can the university support the necessary and appropriate training and information of staff and students at RGU on LGBT plus rights, which leads to issues such as misgendering and incorrect pronouns? Because it pertains to the university, I'll start with the right and then make my way left.
So that's just sitting around there. I think it's interesting that we're running an event that's hosted by the Students' Union, having this conversation, and I suppose I'm forced to reflect. And actually, we don't necessarily have this type of event for staff members, and maybe we should. And actually, I think that is something that is worthwhile exploring. Yes, there are introductory courses around equality and diversity. Yes, it's covered off in terms of staff training and awareness, but actually, there potentially is an opportunity to reinforce that with our staff community.
One thing that I find is very important is that this training is provided by LGBTQ people. So people who actually know about it, experienced it, and can therefore genuinely speak for the community. At least, obviously, you can't generalize, but who have that experience. That would be a great wish from us.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously within a uni, students and staff, so you would hope that both would have equal understanding and information, I guess, just to, this is if everyone here is to learn and to, have a good experience. And so things like that just aid it in being able to be the reason that you'd want to be here, you want to learn, that those sorts of things aren't gonna deter you from being here, I guess.
I think having seen what the types of inclusivity training from my kind of regular day-to-day boarding job is really interesting, the conversations that then occur from that amongst people who aren't part of the community, because then you kind of get into a realm where I guess people are kind of assuming certain aspects and then kind of relaying and having that conversation with each other. And it's maybe not very helpful because then it's maybe spreading kind of misinformation almost, or a misunderstanding. So I think having people from the community be a part of that as a kind of starting point or maybe guidance throughout that is helpful. But then again, it's you can't generalize and assume that everyone, every LGBT person is going to have that same view of how to do that. So I don't know, it's difficult, but I think that would be better at least.
All right, so that's, you'll be thankful to hear the end of my questions, but thanks everyone for their really thoughtful answers. We're now on to audience questions. And I think we'll take some from the live audience, if they have any, and then we'll move to the online. So if anyone has any questions, please just stick your hand up or shout out or whatever you feel comfortable with. So it's going to be like that, huh? No, that's okay. Maybe we'll kickstart with some online questions if we have any. None? Wow. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Kaylin. I'm from the States, so like hearing this conversation was like kind of weird because I feel like conversations like where I'm from the States when like this would never happen. But something since I have family here that was like big in the States when it became like I think it was last year when like LGBTQ history is now required to be taught in schools. Especially in the States, a lot of that has been erased. It's actually illegal in the state I'm from to have a conversation in school discussing pronouns, sexuality, gender issues in general as well. Have you seen like a shift here at all since it's like now required to teach LGBTQ history in schools at all? Do you think that's helped or, yeah, I guess that's my question.
Thank you for that, and really thank you for that. I think we'd be struggling to come up with something. I'll let anyone on the panel, if anyone feels really passionate about it, just go for it and answer that question.
It's hard to know not being in school. I would hope so. I don't know.
Well, I mean, certainly the figures would suggest that is the case. Less people don't feel that they're going to school. Less people feel they're having a bad experience, even though that figure might be half the century of LGBT young people than they were, say, in 2012 in the previous study had been done. The age of coming out has declined in Scotland by a full year from 16 to 15 over the course of the decade. So, you know, not having any connection with a school by secondary curriculum, it's difficult to know. But the figures would suggest that it does make a difference. But I think the other things that make a difference, I didn't get a chance to say this in my ramblings, probably lasted too long, so apologies, was that actually if you look at, say, pop music over the last 4 decades, it has generally enabled, I think, like I sort of mentioned Boy George, and the sort of era of, I suppose, naivety or slight wonderment about what was going on there. But if you look at the flamboyance of the 1970s, there is a very, very thinly disguised LGBT rights issue. If you look to the 1980s, that tradition becomes very political, actually, in response to the social movement. So it's no longer about celebrating freedoms, actually. There's a great Pet Shop Boys line, which is about you're so flamboyant, you require police action. And it's a direct commentary on the fact that actually in the 1970s, that sort of flamboyant LGBT lifestyle, in inverted commas, would have been pretty acceptable. And in the 80s, it's the type of thing that would have actually led you to be beaten up by policemen with truncheon. You see that in soap operas today. So I think that these social pressures, if you like, in the UK probably have just as much influence, if not more, in terms of the wider society than what might be taught in schools. And if anything, that's coming quite late and on the back of other cultural currents.
Does anyone else on the panel have any thoughts on the question? I'll take that as a no. Thanks for your question. I'm not sure if any have came in yet, but if it's okay, oh, yes, please.
Hi, I'm Patricia Innocent, and I don't have a question. I just want to appreciate the fact that you created this forum because I'm from a society where they don't allow you to talk about L or G, not to talk about B, T, and the rest, you know. So I came here to learn and understand better so I could be better educated. And I have learned a whole lot, and I would really appreciate if things like this are continuously done in the school environment so more people could have a better understanding and learn better. So really thank you for this.
No, we really, Danny's kind of to thank there in the corner for these Thinking Out Loud events. We're trying to encourage a bit of debate and discussion on issues. We had one on sustainability, and I think we're hoping to have at least one more this year. So yes, hopefully we'll do more of these. So thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Yes.
If everything was perfect in the next 10 years, where do you think RG would be? What steps do you think could be taken in the ideal world that 10 years from now we look at and think we did everything we could?
Interesting question. I'll start off from the left, and then I'll head to the right.
I feel like it's hard to answer as someone who's like, you know, not staff or like in control of like anything that happens here. But it's difficult, right? Because it's like you're always going to have people, like everyone's so different that they're like, what is perfect? I really don't know.
Perfect to you as an individual, because I mean, as Matt can say, if we separate it out to theoretical, it becomes very difficult. But you personally, as the panel.
Any thoughts?
I feel like because we studied at Gray's, like at the art school, maybe we were in a bit of like a
Bit of a bubble.
Yeah, like a bubble, because I feel like it seems like, I don't know, it's much smaller than some of the other schools, and
It's literally like away over
far in
there.
the distance.
And, yeah, there's obviously a lot of LGBT students there, and
Like
anyone who isn't is like very aware that we're there. So.
Yeah, and there's like definitely a sense of community and people know each other. So.
And that is because of the types of people who are coming there. So.
Yeah. So
in order, I guess it's like what can a uni do to deal with people who have an issue with the LGBT community? But I don't know.
No.
Slap them all in the face.
I think there's a couple things that have been mentioned throughout this discussion, which is just, I guess, make it easier for LGBTQ students to feel comfortable, make it easier for trans students to identify as they do here, and that be accepted and respected. We were slightly mentioning that the student network and the staff network of LGBTQ haven't really worked together in the recent years, mostly because of the pandemic. I think that would be very interesting to see, even just next year, next semester. I know there's always with funding in societies, so I'm coming from the point of view of being a part of the LGBTQ student network, and I would love for us to be more active, but that just takes establishing that we are here, for students to know that, for us to organize funding, to do bigger events, to include more students, to raise more awareness. These are the kind of maybe dream perfect things that could exist at the university, but they take a lot of work, and they take a lot of volunteering work as well. So
I suppose it almost like seems like an extracurricular thing, you know?
Yeah, it is.
Like, so then should it be, you know, beamed to everyone as soon as they get here, as soon as they start their course, you know? You should be aware, like, that this is here and it's important. Like, is that the way that is, or like, do people come and they figure it out for themselves? I don't know.
I think the point would be that everyone is aware that the LGBTQ network exists and that it creates safe spaces, but obviously you can't know at what point in a life that a person will realize something about themselves, maybe realize that they do identify as LGBTQ and find comfort in the network. Some LGBTQ students don't want to have it a big part of their journey, a big part of their identity, so they might not attend events and such. And I feel like that it would be great if there's room for all of that at the university.
I think from my side, perfection, aside from the fact that by their nature can never be attained, that's a philosophical discussion. For me, it's, what shall I say quite carefully here, I was involved in the early years of the staff network we set up a number of years ago. And for me, actually, perfection would be not repeating the experience of having staff members turn up to that network. Essentially, is the only way in which they could share with anyone in their workplace what their sexual orientation was. and actually having to listen to some very tough stories and actually journeys that people made about their own decisions as a consequence of being involved in the Staff Network, about how they came out to the colleagues that they worked with, having kept actually that part of their identity, who they lived with, what they did outside of work, entirely cut off from their work colleagues, which actually is a very difficult experience for those individuals to go through. Not because necessarily they're worried about the reaction that they might have. I think we do genuinely have a very inclusive environment in the workplace, because actually at that point you're then worried that actually you're complicit in a lie, essentially, and you're then telling your colleagues, well actually there's been part of me that's been lying to you about what I've done outside of work or an important part of my work, and actually it's more about how people feel that that element will have a reaction to them. So I think my perfection would be that actually that doesn't happen in 10 years' time.
Thank you, everyone. If anyone has anything to add, please feel free. Oh, yes.
Right, just want to add to what Vincent said. I really enjoyed the session, learned so much, and reflected on my own experiences. I really want the panel's advice around, as the university and union jointly sort of bring about change to equality, diversity, inclusion matters, how do we avoid conflict between perhaps competing rights, where in other universities they've had terrible difficulties around discussions, trans versus women's rights versus other faith groups. How do we have those conversations in a safe space where everyone can feel safe and everyone can feel included, so that we develop and change together? What advice would you give to the university and the union around that?
Could I kick off? And it goes back to what I said earlier, right at the very outset of what I said at the start, which is that we all have 9 protected characteristics. And actually, you could have faith and be an LGBT individual. And that often is a very difficult thing for the LGBT community to understand and comprehend. Often, actually, a lot of my LGBT friends have difficulties with the fact that I'm a Catholic and don't mind admitting that I am, because of what they perceive as, in some instances correctly, the historic discrimination of not just the Catholic Church, but really organised religion in general. Likewise, there are, so that kind of conflict actually exists within individuals. And I think for me, that is the starting point, actually. All have to address those conflicts in some way, shape or form. And actually events like this potentially allow us a way of saying, actually at a human, personal level, here are the conflicts that take place with me. It's not about having a primacy of identity. I'm not a gay man above all else. No, I'm a complex individual that has many dimensions to my life. And I think that's the danger of an abstractization of equality, is that it essentially becomes, oh well, the rights for this group of people trump rights for that group of people. It is no such thing. It's about recognizing actually we all, as human beings, identify differently on a multiplicity of levels. And the more we remember that, the more we hear that, the more we feel able to share that ourselves, actually, I think the less absolute a lot of these debates become.
Absolutely, I fully agree with that. And it is very often that we hear the extreme points of view or just the polarizing points of view, while we completely forget to find out how they can coexist. So it is about having discussions about it and recognizing the individual needs and recognizing solutions to how everything can coexist.
I feel like what Duncan was saying is like almost to me sounds like that's how you kind of like reduce that kind of combat, I guess, that you're talking about. But at the moment, it's like you also have to just be aware that like there is going to be, or conflict, sorry, is the right word, that is going to exist and that is going to happen. Like we're very much in a period where like this happening because there are conflicts, you know. So being able to know how to deal with it and make sure people, like, I suppose, like mentally or emotionally recover from those incidences, but knowing that like they are going to happen, like it's inevitable.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry to keep the question.
All right, it's more like an addition and a kind of to share my personal experience in relating to what we've been talking about. You know, coming here, I don't really know much about LGBTQ, you know, but now I know this a little bit. But one thing I realized is that this LGBTQ has been in existence for a long time, even maybe before many of us here were born. You know, but over the years, so many people have been, you know, suffering from, you know, isolation. People in this category deprived of their rights and privileges, and just like what he mentioned, everybody just have to be happy, and we should be proud of who we are, and that we have a life. We have, you know, we should be able to enjoy, you know, every moment of our life, and nobody should be deprived of that. And now, looking at the topic, lowering borders and promoting equality and diversity for everyone, you know, I don't know why we should have more audience than this. You know, from the way I see this, it is meant for the general public to receive, you know, this diversity in our communities, because what really makes life interesting is about varieties. We cannot be the same. That's why we have various religion, you know, and if you look at the countries that are trying to, you know, unify, you know, maybe the religion, they're actually having problems. But for countries who have, who give allowance for, you know, different belief system, you know, people are enjoying, you know, their religion, and the same thing should happen in this kind of situation where we have right now the LGBTQ people, you know, which I think it is important that this kind of forum should be made public, so that even people who are not in that category should understand that there are people in this category, and we should be ready or be willing to receive everyone the way they are, and be ready to live happily with everybody, so that everywhere can be a better place. And the best place to start the kind of thing is institutions, you know, university, you know, colleges, because what happened here is what is transferred to the outside world there, because we're not going to be here forever, and whatever we learn here, we express out there. So this is should be like a training ground for everyone, whether you are LGBTQ or you're not, to understand that, okay, there are category of people like this, and we should be willing and eager to, you know, relate with ourselves, and nobody should be deprived of happiness, of friendship, of privileges and rights, you know, just to buttress the topic, lowering borders, you know, making the world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think I'd like to ask the panel if they have any reflections on that, about maybe opening events like this to more staff and students. Maybe that relates to what we were talking about earlier, but staff and student kind of training and coming together. So I'd like to ask the panel if they would like to sort of reflect on that and thoughts they had on that statement. And I'll go from left to right here. I feel like people are afraid when I say that now.
I suppose I'd just like to say, like, I totally agree that, like, this is a great environment to be having these conversations, because, like you say, you know, like, these are places of education, and, like, this is about learning. So, yeah, more of it. But, I mean, I would love to do this in a more casual setting as well, to be honest. So maybe a more variety of these kinds of
So
events.
in addition to what I said, I think it's important that what you mentioned, that every individual, no matter who you are, the kind of category you belong to, I understand the danger of acceptance, but we should also be proud to, to express who we are, because whether we like it or not, it has come to stay. COVID started, nobody wanted it, but COVID, we are dealing with it right now, and we are managing it. So no matter who you are, and I believe in future, so many, threats still going to come out from humanity that we have to deal with and still be able to manage. So no matter who you are, you must be ready to or happy to express yourself so that you can be happy with yourself. Because if you are not happy with yourself, nobody can make you happy. And one last thing I forgot to mention, I had this experience going on. I believe nobody, LGBT wasn't existent, but there is someone I can classify that is in that category. Being isolated, and all that, suffering it, in private, and because of that, is now using, a kind of a wrong way to influence people so that it can form a kind of community to create acceptance. And I think we should watch out for that. And that is the reason why we should accept this in that community and not stigmatize anyone in that category. So that people in that category will not, try to, use something that can, a negative tool to create acceptance so that it can just happen, naturally. Just like you are who you are naturally, so that it can just be blended into the society. I don't know if you get what I'm saying.
I think it's important that we do have events like this where people don't have to hide who they are. And because you referred to Duncan, what he was saying, I'd like to sort of ask him to reflect on what you were saying and some of the points that you raised there, if that's okay that I'm picking on you.
About 20 years ago, when I was president of the Students' Association, the starting officers here, this is a good ruse to try with the universities. But we planned a trip to America to see what student services were like in America. Because they're very different, actually. The concept of student affairs, even now, is very different from what it is here. There's a lot that we can learn from what goes on there. And I think there's a book that was published about that time looking at student learning outside of the classroom, actually, and the importance it played in contributing to people's identity as it was shaping during their university experience. One of the chapters was about diversity and how diversity was promoted at a particular university. And it talked about something that I think is completely alien in the UK higher education context, which was essentially a compulsory element of everyone's undergraduate degree. Where they had to learn about various topics. Diversity included in this talk. It consisted of a group of staff and students representing, I suppose, the diverse campus at this American campus. And the person who was writing it, they were perspectives of individual students. The person who was writing this was a white American who said that they looked at the panel, they couldn't work out why the white male was sitting at the end of the panel because they were diverse. They were a white male. He said it's only when he spoke that actually and they spoke about their identity as an LGBT individual. That's when they realized that actually an awful lot of diversity isn't in terms of what you see, but what is unseen by the populace. That individual then went on to become very active in their LGBT rights within the school. And I genuinely think that sort of compulsory element within a curriculum has some merits. And I think that is a suggestion, we should say, which is entirely personally inspired.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if we have any online questions, or if we're still bad. And does anyone else have any questions in the audience? Yes, please.
So I'm Fiona, and I apparently run the staff network, LGBT staff network. It's, as you alluded earlier, been very quiet for the last few years due to the pandemic, mostly also busy lives and working from home makes it a lot harder to do it, but definitely something that we want as a staff network that we've got, the small staff network that we have, is to do more events with the student network. And I've been here for 5 years now, just had my 5-year anniversary last week. So I joined the network very quickly after coming into the university. And we have had waves of doing lots, we have had waves of doing not a lot, and the student network has been exactly the same. And I think it is quite a cyclical thing. And so I think having the support of the union and having some support of the staff who are hopefully going to be here a little bit more consistently than the students who circulate, that's, I think, where we're going to potentially see. So getting regular events and regular recognition. I also sit on the Equality and Diversity Forum, and one of the things that we brought to that was it needs to be driven by the university being aware that it's LGBT History Month, and that the university will step up. And Emmanuel was here, but he's just stepped out, but he's the Equality and Diversity Advisor for the university. So there's been lots of things that have been brought in to really help and support the university to do that. So I think it's not really a question to the panel, but it's that commitment to say, we've come here today to do this event, what more can we be doing? And like, you've all committed that you want to see more, but what kinds of events, that's probably my question, what kinds of events do this audience, from maybe our audience participation as well, but what more events do we want to see? What kinds of things would people do? And that comment there about getting the allies involved as well. These events are not just if you identify as LGBTQIA, the whole alphabet of it these days, is how do we get the allies to come and want to learn more and be more inclusive with us? So what events and how can we encourage allies to do? Would be my questions.
Thank you. I think it'd be good to pass that on to, can you put your hand up if you're a member of the LGBT network here today? So I'll pass that on to you first, her question there. What's your thoughts on it? What would your opinion be on that?
I think one of the main reasons the LGBTQ student network is specifically a network instead of a society is so that we can organize open events so that no one has to come out or has to identify a specific way to attend. But I do know that those events are meant to be more of a social safe space for LGBTQ students. So I definitely think to get allies involved, events like this that are open to everyone and that are backed and organized by the union as well are very important, because the LGBTQ student network is run by LGBTQ students, and we can't claim to have any kind of like academic knowledge on it, or like we're not here to teach people about LGBTQ issues. We are here to have a good time kind of and get to know other people and just have a safe space. So definitely finding that balance of just creating the safe social spaces, but also creating opportunities to learn. So possibly more events like this is how I would say reaching allies is the best way to do.
Okay, before I put it out to members of the audience, does anyone else on the panel have any opinions or takes on that? I'll take that as a no. So those who put their hand up before, do you have any opinions on what the LGBT network could do events-wise and how they could engage people? Yeah, please.
I would love to see something between the LGBT network and the students and the staff come together. Just because I do know that I have some trans friends who find a little bit of discomfort in the fact that there are there's certain staff members that we know of that aren't necessarily on the same page of supporting their rights. And I think if we had an opportunity for people to actually ask the hard questions and have the space to talk about that with staff as students, that would be really, really helpful.
Okay, I'd like to put that to the panel first, see if they have any reflections or thoughts on that.
I suppose it's hard to get people to come along to something if they already don't agree with it, but I suppose maybe that's something that is like supplementary to other things that are more kind of like compulsory for staff members, that could be implemented in order to actually have, I guess, just like some base level of like respect for different groups of people.
There's been talks about having a conversation with the union and having trans people from the LGBTQ student network to have a discussion, but I think the thing that we always come across that it's very exhausting to have to advocate for yourself. It's very exhausting and it can be very exhausting and can be very difficult for trans students to come forward and explain specifically how they are uncomfortable, because it's already exhausting to live through the experience. So it's finding a balance between that of making a space where they feel they can express themselves, and also possibly just that they can express their opinions and that can be put forward to the staff and to the union as well.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting point. A sort of mini follow-up I would have to that is, I totally understand it would be very frustrating to advocate for yourself, as you said. How best can people like myself in the union, and this is kind of a question that we spoke about earlier, but maybe with added context, how do we sort of educate ourselves on the sensitivities enough where we can constructively engage with trans students who come to us for assistance? And I should note onto that, we are very keen to hear from you.
If we're going specifically for sensitivities and how to learn how to handle situations or conflicts if they come up, it's going to professionals who talk about it, not relying on students to tell you about their experience, but seeking out professionals who are willing to talk about it, who are trained in talking about it, who get paid for the emotional labor that they need to do to talk about it.
I think that's an interesting point, because we're talking about the training, and perhaps it's that staff and students need sort of someone to come in. And so I'd like to return to the original question. What do you think about that and some of the answers you've heard from the panel regarding your question?
Yeah, I do agree. It would be quite difficult to, if you've got some challenging staff, they are probably not going to be your allies that turn up to your ally events. So it's how do we get that message to those people? That's a really difficult one. And we will open up ours and invite the staff population to it. But yeah, I think it's an ideal world that the people who will come and get educated, that need educated, 9 times out of 10 people who come are the ones who already have a little bit of education. So it's great to actually hear some people here saying, I didn't know much about it and I wanted to come and learn, because that's absolutely the audience that we really wanted to target, is those who don't know very much about it and want to, and are willing to learn. But yeah, I agree with the panel that it's very difficult for us to advocate to people who don't want to change their opinion. It's not that we want to change their opinion, we just want to open up their opinion and see it from another side and allow them to make an educated decision rather than potentially what they've got at the moment is just an uneducated decision. So, but yeah, that's something that myself and Emmanuel have had a couple of meetings. I know he's not there because he's sat there and he's really annoyed. He's like, no, we've had a couple of meetings about what's next for the staff network and then maybe how can we match it up with students. So definitely great to hear about any potential events they want to do.
Thank you so much for that. If anyone on the panel would like to add to that, please feel free. No, that's fine. Don't worry. Yeah, I think it's important to emphasise, myself and Dami at the Student Union, we're very keen to hear from LGBT plus students, very keen to help in ways we can, very much keen to engage with staff. And yeah, I think it's nice that we've opened up a dialogue. And I hope that people in the audience do feel comfortable that we can communicate with each other and can make stuff happen outside of this event. So thank you so much for that. Does anyone else have any questions? Have we got any online yet? No. Wow. I was hoping maybe we'd lost Wi-Fi or something. Okay. Well, if no one has any more questions, I think one thing I'd like to ask is sort of reflecting on LGBT plus History Month. What's sort of generally just what's the panel's thoughts on it? just a sort of, because I know this is quite a formal kind of, and maybe it's a wee bit stuffy, but I want this to, I know everyone says like the sort of that casual lecture is like, yeah, I want this to be a conversation, and it can be quite difficult. But what's your reflections on the month, and is there anything sort of on your mind about this that you'd like to put out to the forum to discuss, either to union, to staff, to people, and is there anything going forward that we can sort of advocate for, where we get a more equal and fair university campus? That's a very loaded, or not loaded, it's a very wordy question.
I'll have a quick list of probably the least stuffy meeting I'm going to be involved in.
I think for myself, it's just kind of, I myself don't feel like I know enough about LGBTQ history, even though I'm an LGBTQ person. Kind of everything that I've learned is just through osmosis most of the time, like existing in LGBTQ spaces. So I think it's a good time to learn when resources are being more advertised, more put out there. But also just for me personally, I take it as a month to rejoice and be social and remember that I'm not alone and that I'm in a community, and really just enjoying that in a social space.
I would say, having done research for my dissertation when I was studying here on LGBT history, and it wasn't a massive amount that I did, but even in that time, I learned so much. So I guess I would just advocate for people to go and read and watch and listen, and just it's very eye-opening and perspective changing. I think it's a good time to do it because the resources are there,
I think that leads very well on to our next point, which is, what was our question?
I just wanted to add something.
Yes.
My thoughts on the month, which is my general thoughts about a lot of history months. It's just that, as was mentioned earlier, we should not just focus on the tumultuous events of the last 50 years and in just certain countries, because it makes it seem as if it's being LGBT is a symptom of modern society. It's important to remember and acknowledge and learn about the existence of different types of LGBT people around the world and in different periods of time, just to realize how normal of an existence this is and how naturally has existed everywhere around us. And not just in the human species, but literally everywhere on Earth for multiple years. And it's not, again, just a thing that is recent and in certain Western senses only. So yeah, just my thought.
Thanks for that. I think that's a really interesting point, and kind of what Duncan was saying earlier, that we do have a lot of LGBT plus representation throughout our history. And so, unless anyone has anything they'd like to add or sort of closing remarks, I believe we have a video on LGBT plus History Month.
It will no longer be a criminal offence. Homosexual behavior between adults should no longer be a criminal offence.
The whole atmosphere was enough to be angry about, really, and that anger built into protests.
And of course, people's attention, not by violence, but by just saying, look, we're here, we're the same as you are, we're as good as you are.
When you went on the march, you knew that you were there to protest. You knew you were there to be angry.
Because we must remember, human rights and civil liberties are never encased in steel and cement to protect them.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
I want younger people to realise that they need to get up and march themselves now. There are an increasing number of people out there who are feeling emboldened in hating queers.
breaking news at this hour from Orlando, where there are reports of a shooting at a nightclub in that city.
Estamos aquí para lamentar. Estamos aquí para vivir. We're here because we have to be.
There are over 74 million LGBT people who live in countries that criminalize them.
We talk about being marginalized as LGBT people, yet LGBT people are doing something themselves.
Our job is to show people that there is a politics going on and that there's a fight that you can join. Are you proud? Are you proud?
Thank you for that. So now we are at the end of our event. I'd like to firstly thank the panel here for answering the questions and putting up with my left to right reign of terror. But a big thank you for your insights. Thank you to the audience for being here, for participating, for asking questions. Thank you, Dami, for your help behind the scenes and helping organize. But yeah, I hope everyone's enjoyed and learned from this event. And thank you all so much for coming. So a big round of applause for our panel, please.